Again, I want to welcome everyone to the session today. And okay, so this session is the SPNHC ICOM NATHIST 2020 virtual conference. This is the session for MIDS and MIX. This is the minimum information out of digitisation. So I'm your moderator, Elspeth Haston from the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. And my helpers today are Alex Hardisty from Cardiff University and Laurie Benson. We're going to be getting, I think, additional help from Talia and Deb today as well. So the session will be recorded for later viewing. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you very much to all the speakers in this session. Each presenter will be presenting for 10 minutes, and there will be 5 minutes of questions at the end of each presentation, and time to transition between presenters. So please ask questions of the speakers using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. And these will be asked of the speakers, of the presenters, by the moderator in the order that they are received. So you'll find the chat function that's been made available for technical questions or for conversing with other attendees. Please use this judiciously, as any nefarious or inappropriate use of the chat may result in you being removed from the session, or the chat function may be disabled. Please see our Code of Conduct document for more information. And please also bear with us for any technical difficulties that we may have, and enjoy the session. So without further ado, I would like to pass across to our first presenter today. And this is going to be Alex Hardisty, and he's going to be introducing some of the concepts that you're going to be hearing about today. So I'm just going to share my screen. And that should be fine. And Alex, if you want to start, and I will now mute myself.
Okay, thank you, Elspeth. I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon, good morning, perhaps even good evening to some people. My name is Alex Hardisty from Cardiff University, and I'm going to give you an introduction to minimum information standards for digital specimens and digital collections, MIDS and MIX. I'll speak mainly about MIDS because that's the one that's most well developed at the moment, and also because later speakers in this session are going to talk in more depth about MIX and about describing digital collections. Next slide, please. So we've been working in an integration and consolidation project, ICOM, over the past 2 years. Looking at the needs of the sector to support coherent mass digitisation. And we found a wide variety of understandings of the term digitisation. It means different things to different people. The term is understood diversely to mean, for example, creating database records of greater or lesser extent, making images of collection containers, the specimens in them and or their labels, varying levels of data capture, transcription may or may not be included, and more recently, semantic enrichment of data and notions of being born digital and digital by default. And from one digitisation initiative to another, the outputs can be quite different because the aims and practices and procedures vary across different collection types and institutions. Although in the end, the totality of the resulting data is often similar, the moments when its elements become available in digital form varies widely due to those different aims, practices and procedures. And so when you talk about digitisation, this causes a lot of confusion. And when it comes to planning data management for research infrastructures to be used by multiple institutions and groups and projects in the practice of digitisation and using digitised data, it becomes very difficult if there isn't a common understanding of what is meant by digitisation. And so we started with a very simple definition. Digitisation is the process of converting analogue information about physical specimens to digital form, which includes electronic text, images, and other representations. Next slide, please. We saw that digitisation can lead to two quite different categories of data. It can lead to digital data for collections as a whole, giving an overview of the collection, or to subparts of that collection in the form of inventories of trays of insects or boxes of herbarium sheets, for example. But in general, provides coverage of information about the assets held by an institution. And then there's a much more voluminous category of digital data for individual specimens, that provides explicit and precise details about each of the objects curated, the what, where, the when, and whom of the individual specimens. Next slide, please. Even so, digitisation of digital specimens is based upon diverse aims of specific projects, and this can cause us to ask, what is sufficient digitisation? When is it complete, if ever it's complete? And here's just a few examples of the kinds of things that come from different digitisation activities, some increasingly advanced outcomes. Digitisation can produce records for a collection management system. It can produce data to be published via an aggregator such as VertNet or GBIF. And more increasingly, it can produce what we call semantically rich data, which is processable by machines. Next slide, please. So, inspired by minimum information standards that are adopted in other areas of biology, and based on the research and curation outputs that were put forward in the project by various national museums and herbaria, we've come up with what we hope is a harmonizing framework that helps to clarify what we mean by the different levels of digitisation and the minimum information to be captured and published at each level. And this would make it easier to consistently measure the extent of digitisation over time and to set priorities for remaining digitisation work. It also ensures that enough data are captured and curated and published with specified quality so that they can be useful for the widest possible purposes. And we call this framework MIDS and MICS, or minimum information about digital specimens and minimum information about digital collections. And it's a bit like the idea of a minimum wage. It's the minimum information that's expected, but it's nice when more is encouraged. And so we encourage that out of digitisation, activities should try to produce more than what is actually the minimum that is essential. Next slide, please. In this harmonising framework, we've included making the data publicly available as a specific component, because making data publicly available is so often treated as a separate activity after digitisation. And it's increasingly the case that making data publicly available doesn't just mean making it available for humans, but also making it available for machines, for computers and software to be able to find and access and work with as well. And MIDS and MICS help us to rationalise the typical levels of digitisation seen in processes and procedures across different institutions and collection types. It specifies the information elements expected to be present after each level of digitisation, allowing for the presence of other information elements beyond the minimum, including institutional and collection-specific elements. And the scheme is extensible as well, so that we can extend it in different directions in the future. It treats mainly what we call the data of digitisation rather than images. It includes indications of image availability and availability of other media, but no more than that. The characteristics of the images, the types of the images, they're out of scope of MIDS, but they could be defined elsewhere. Next slide, please. So let's have a look at the different levels of digitisation that MIDS supports. 3 levels of data captured: basic, regular, and extended. At level 1, the basic record provides the simple information about the specimen what it is and in which institution it can be found. Level 2 provides all the regular key fields that have been agreed over a long period of time as being essential for most scientific purposes. And the extended Level 3 record provides for the attachment of other data known about the specimen, including specifically links to third-party information sources and the ability to bring in quality assertions nearer to the digitization process itself. Next slide, please. Note that there's no notion of completeness in MIDS or of a full or complete record, because information is always valuable and can be added to an existing record at any time. Also, that MIDS exists in the context of publishing specimen data and making it accessible online in association with globally unique persistent identifiers such as DOIs, digital object identifiers, or other types of handle identifier. In addition to the core levels, 1 to 3, there's a pre-level, a catalogue level. This is a skeletal record making the first association between a physical specimen and its digital representation that's necessary to support existing procedures in a number of different institutions. Next slide, please. So at level 1, we see that the basic record indicates what a specimen is and where it can be found. The 4 really important pieces of information at this level are the physical specimen identifier, such as its catalogue number, an institution code, the type of material that the specimen is representing, and a name that's appropriate to the specimen. Next slide. At level 2, the regular level, here are all the expected elements that you'd expect to find as a regular output of digitization. Elements concerning the location where the specimen was collected, country, locality, latitude and longitude, altitude and depth, if those are known, name and number of the collector, date of the collection, type, status, geographical region, etc., so on and so forth. Next slide, please. And level 3 extended makes the provision for linking to external sources, and there's just a couple of examples here. For example, if you can link to the occurrence in GBIF or to a DNA sequence from the specimen or a literature reference, level 3 provides for that as well. Next slide, please. I already mentioned the pre-level, level 0, serves to meet specific operational needs in different collection practices. And it supports the practice of creating an almost empty catalogue entry when an identifier is first assigned to a specimen as a prelude to fuller digitization later. It's a place for unambiguous attachment of all of the further digitized data that will result. And it's increasingly useful for accession workflows that are turning more towards data being born digital or digital by default as specimens enter collections. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. It's a brief introduction that I've given you to MIDS, and the concept for MICS is describing collections is similar. The next steps in the work are the following. There are several institutions that have expressed their interest in trying out MIDS and evaluating it and help to develop it further, and we'd be pleased to receive further expressions of interest. We're going to add guidelines to ensure that minimum information is fair. That means findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, and especially by machines. And we're taking this work forward by proposing a new TDWG working group during the summer to take this to standardization. And there's a link there, bit.ly mids v010, where you can see the current draft, and it's open for any comments for anybody who would like to comment. And my contact details are in that document. Thank you, and thank you to all the contributors who've helped with this work before.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Do you want me to?
Hi, Laurie, yes.
Do you want me to ask the questions? Or
yes, that would be super. That would be, if you can do that, that would be great.
Okay, Alex, the first question is from, oh dear, I'm not going to get this name right. Pepin from Naturalis. Are there standards for quantifying the accuracy of GPS coordinates regarding the information in MIDS level 2?
There probably are standards for quantifying the accuracy of GPS coordinates, although I'm not personally familiar with those. And it might be appropriate to add those as a requirement for the coordinate data in MIDS, but that's not a discussion that we've had up until now. I'll make a note to do that.
Okay, the next one is from Helen James. How does MIDS line up with Darwin core parameters?
We're aiming to map the information elements that MIDS identifies as being necessary in each of the levels to corresponding terms in both Darwin core and in ABCD. But it is the case that there are not terms in those two standards for all of the things that appear in MIDS.
Okay, here's from Nina in Russia. Thank you, Alex, for the interesting talk. Perhaps you could add historical note on how and why these two standards, ABCD and DWC, evolved.
Okay, so I would say that in some respects, MIDS is an evolution from the position we have today, where ABCD and Darwin core are being increasingly widely used. But neither of those standards tell you how to use those standards. MIDS goes further insofar as it's trying to express expectations for what should come out of digitization processes at various levels. It builds on ABCD and Darwin core.
Okay. Where are we with time, Elspeth?
Yes, we've got about 1
More
minute.
questions?
I think we can manage one more question and I'll just get things set up for the next talk.
Okay. Well, there's I guess there's two. One is there a link to the draft of the standards, and can you post it?
I'll post the link to the draft MIDS specification in the chat in a moment.
Okay. And are there any initiatives to capture standards to support research interest of humanities scholars as well?
I would say that we have not specifically addressed the need, spoken to as humanities scholars to see whether MIDS and MIX address their needs at the moment, but we would be very interested to have that discussion, and if Brad would like to contact me either via the chat or by searching for me on Google, then I'd be happy to have that discussion.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple more questions, but I think you can probably answer them in the chat.
I will answer them in the chat in the background. Thank you.
That would be great. Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you, Laurie, for helping with the questions. We're going to move to our next talk now. Certainly, if I can manage the transition, that would be great. That should be... Right, apologies. Share screen. Okay, and the next talk is by Wouter Addink from the Naturalis Institute.
Thank you, Elspeth. Next slide, please. I did a quick investigation about how much specimen collection in Europe are currently digitized and published in GBIF as either preserved specimen, fossil specimen, or living specimens. And it occurs that only about 4.8% of the estimated 1.5 billion specimen in collections in Europe are currently digitized and published. So what does it mean? Next slide, please. This means that 95% of the collections that we have in Europe can today only be discovered by providing collection descriptions. So collection descriptions is a very important tool in addition to the specimen information that's shared with GBIF and other infrastructures to discover collections that are present in Europe. In TDWG, there is a community standard under construction, which is TDWG CD collection descriptions, which will be used to describe natural science collections. This is a draft data model. You can find more information about that in the TDWG website. Okay, next slide, please. So collections can be described on many different levels of detail. Here are a few examples. For instance, on the bottom left, you see a description from the insect collection in Naturalis, where you see that there is only a one paragraph description of the collection plus an estimation of the size of the collection. But you also see a screen with a mock-up that's under construction for the digitization status of collections in the Synthesis Plus project, a European funded project, which gives much more detailed information. And on the bottom right, you see part of the detailed information that is needed to be collected for that. There you see here preservation type as one dimension to describe, plus the MIDS levels for each of these preservation types. So the level of detail to describe collection can really vary. Okay, next slide, please. You cannot do everything with a collection description. So if you, for instance, want to know how many specimens there are by estimation in the collections in Europe that have specimens preserved in fluids that are arthropods, which were collected from France in the period 1800 to 1850 by a collector called Janssen, then this is a query that you could only answer if you had described your collection with dimensions on preservation methods, taxonomic group, country of origin, time period, and collector. And that would mean that you would need a matrix to cover all the possible estimated numbers for all these dimensions. So imagine you see an example on the right part of the screen where you have a matrix with only two dimensions, one for discipline and one for continent. Where for these two dimensions, if you have 3 values for each dimension, you have already 9 values to fill in. So for these 5 dimensions, if you had 10 distinct possible values, and there will probably be many more because you can have many more collectors, then you would already have 100,000 values to fill in. And that would take so much time that you could spend that time better on digitizing your collection. With digitized specimen data, however, this will be easy because each specimen you can identify individually have values for each of these dimensions as part of the specimen description. And you can store it in a database and query. Next screen, please. So what we would like to do in this go is have these collection descriptions for these 95% of the collections that are not yet digitized, and mix these together with the detailed information from the specimens if we have it. So I have here specified 2 possible levels for mix. One is an overview level where you only have the structured description of a collection, so a name of a collection plus a description of consisting of a few fields like the total number of the specimens in the collection, a short 1 paragraph description, whether it contains types, etc. And another level, which is more an inventory level, where you can specify different dimensions plus their metrics. And that could then be on different levels. You can have that on a drawer level of the collection entirely, on the collection holdings in an institute as a whole. And if we mix that with the specimen detail information, then we could answer questions on the highest level possible if we have the information in a different digitized status available. Next slide, please. In DISCO, we have different classes of natural science collections. Our main focus is on institutional collections, which are collections that are collection descriptions that are meant to describe the collection holdings as a whole. So these are collections that are owned by an institute with a focus on providing access, and the description should have no overlap. So that the total of the individual collection descriptions describe the total collection holdings in an institute. Some examples can be an herbarium collection, or a zoo, a minerals collection, or an archive, etc. We also have other classes of natural science collections, like private collections, and other collections that are can be an aggregate of collections, or specific collections about a particular place or a particular person that collected that collection. There are also things that we do not see as collections, but as data sets. For example, all the pages of a digitized field book, we would not see that as a collection, but as a data set, or a group of records in a data set or a database. That would be a data set and not a collection. Okay, next slide, please. So we want to establish a European index for all this collection information. Currently, in the institutes, in the DISCO partners, we have an estimation of about 527 million specimens, but that's only part of the institutes in Europe, which we estimate at 1.5 billion objects in total. All the collection holdings in the DISCO partners are in scope. We focus on specimen collections in this index, although other collections in the institutes are also in scope. For instance, an archive can be in scope because you may want to provide access to that archive for digitization on demand, for instance. But we are not going to describe these collections that are not specimen collections in the same level of detail as we are going to do for the specimen collections. And we aim to describe the specimen collection holdings as one European collection. Okay, next slide, please. One service that we are currently creating that could use this European collection index is ELVIS, a European loans and visit system. I will tell you more about that in the general SPNHC session after this session. This will be an integrated system for Europe to support loans, visits, and applications for digitization on demand. And you see here a mock-up of a screen that contains some of the collection description data. So you would be able, as an institute, to manage that information directly in ELVIS, but you could also do that in one of the sources that the information could be derived from, or in ICOR itself. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of a possible global workflow. We see here, in addition, also a CTAF registration system. That's a system by CTAF to hold collection descriptions and institutional information. You could use that to enter your data, and then it could go into the European Collection Index. And from there, it could also be used in services like Elvis. So there will be different ways to manage your data. It should not really matter in which of the systems you are managing your data. It could also be the Digitisation service where you manage your data. We should be able to reuse the data, whether it's coming from one source or another. Okay, the last slide, please. There are some challenges with this. First of all, to describe the collections as one virtual collection, we need really a highly standardized description of the dimensions, and there should be no overlap in specimen between the collection descriptions. Finding collection descriptions in sources like Geocycle is a challenge currently because you cannot rely on an institutional identifier like a ROR or grid identifier. So instead, you would have to find an institution name, which can have many variants in different systems. Also, finding published collection data sets in GWF with the specimen records is a challenge, not only because you cannot rely on an institutional identifier, but also because institutions not always match to a data publisher in GWF. Some examples, we have an institution which is called Bavarian Natural History Collections in this go, but the GWF publisher name is Staatliche Naturwissenschaftliche Sammlungen Bayerns. This is quite different. Another example is the Westerdijk Institute. This is called CBS Fungal Biodiversity Center in GWF. This is the old name of the institute. The University of Jyväskylä, I hope that I pronounced that right. In GWF, the publisher is the museum of that university, the section of natural sciences, etc. We can also see that sometimes the institute is not in GWF as a publisher, but rather as a data set. So, for instance, the publisher Pluto F has a data set called Estonian University of Life Sciences, which contains the data from that university. So one hint to finish, get an institution identifier if you don't have one yet. About 50% of our institutions has one already. It should not take you much more than about 30 minutes to get one, and it's free. Okay, this is it.
Thank you very much, Wouter. I know there's some questions been coming up, so Laurie, can I ask you to handle the questions again?
Sure. I will start. Some of these came in at the cusp time, so I'm not quite sure which presentation, but the first one is from Barbara Tiers. How does MICS correspond to the NCD standards being developed by TDWG? Is there any collaboration between the two to ensure global uniformity?
Yes, so the intention is to use the standard that's currently under construction in TDWG. This is no longer called NCD, but it's called CD. So because it could cover in the future all kinds of collection descriptions, not only natural collection descriptions. So the previous draft standard in TDWG was called NCD, and the standard currently being worked on is CD. And MICS wants to use that standard as its core.
Okay. Could you overview shortly existing portals which already accumulate the collection's descriptions data?
There are a couple of that we are planning to use. One is the CTAF portal with the CTAF passport data. One is Geocycle. This is currently hosted by GWF. Then we have the herbarium collection information, Index Herbarium that we would like to use. probably through GeoCycle, because that information is already available in GeoCycle. And there may be others as well.
Okay, will DISCO seek partnerships with institutions outside of Europe, but contain material from Europe?
Well, DISCO is a consortium of partners in Europe, but of course we seek partnerships with institutes outside of Europe. We have these already, and with other stakeholders outside of Europe, with other research infrastructures, with stakeholders like DUF, etc.
Okay, and the last question I have is, this is from Helen James. Sorry, I haven't been giving you names. How are the collections in the different museums linked? Is the data in each museum shared to one central node, or does the DISCO search engine somehow visit each museum's server?
It's a good question. The collections are not yet linked currently. We want to make a transition that we go from individual collection registration systems in the individual museums to a global space where we have all the scientific information from these collections curated in a community effort.
I think that's all the questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Laurie. And thank you, Wouter, for answering all the questions and a great talk. I can see there's a lot of information coming through in the chat. So please continue to use the chat, putting some information in there. But also please remember to use the Q&A for any questions that you have. So we're now going to go across to the next talk. And I'll just share my screen again. And this talk is going to be by Matt Woodburn from the NHM London. So I just want to check Matt, is your sound okay?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, it is. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Elspeth. And hello, everybody. So, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk briefly about the emerging TDWG collection description standard and how it can help to define a minimum information about a digital collection specification for DISCO. So, in essence, it's a bit of a more long-winded answer to a couple of the questions that Wouter got there. Next slide, please. So to introduce collection descriptions, I quite like to start with the big picture. I think we commonly agree that one of the great utopian visions for the natural science collections community is a future where we've created a digital object for every physical object within our collections and made them freely available for anyone to access. Once we've achieved that, we can then use those digital specimen records to build the pictures of our collections as a whole, so the taxonomic groups collected, geographic scope, and so on. However, the reality is that we still have quite a long way to go on that. And in the meantime, digitized specimens represent just the tip of the iceberg, really, with the majority of our collections are still in the somewhat murky depths below the waterline. And that, digitally speaking, is something of a grey area. There have been various initiatives to create registries of collections, and some have been more successful than others. But in general, they're not particularly standardized and interoperable, and the data can also be quite sparse and text heavy, so difficult for humans and for machines in particular to query and access. So until we reach that state of utopia, we need a more standardized approach to describing our undigitized collections and making them digitally discoverable. We need more higher level information now in order to help us to mobilize more specimen data for more objects in a strategic, coordinated manner. Next slide, please. So who's currently working on these kind of collection descriptions? Well, firstly, there are a number of major global, regional and national initiatives with which many of you will be familiar that have a keen interest in this area. Some of them, like GBIF, CTAF, Addink, Bio and DISCO, as you've just heard about, have collection descriptions as a key part of their near-term development plans. But also at a more grassroots level, there are various collections holding institutions that are running or developing quite detailed collection description schemes. And there will be many others across our community who have made an attempt, or more likely many attempts, at summarising their collections and sub-collections in response to different surveys, or to help with collections management, or just to display on their websites, and so on. Next slide, please. But when we talk about these initiatives and requirements across the wider collection communities, then a common set of challenges do tend to emerge. There's a lack of standardization across platforms and data sets, which are using different data models, schemas, and standards. And this limits the interoperability between those data sets and their ability to be easily discovered and queried using software tools and interfaces. It also means duplication of effort, as institutions are asked to provide data in different shapes to multiple platforms, and it takes time and effort to generate and provide that data. And we're all busy people who only have so much time to spare. There are also challenges in incentivizing people to provide the data. What tangible benefit will they gain from investing that time and effort that they could be spending on other things? And also there's the issue of sustainability. So each separate initiative requires ongoing investment of resources and funding to maintain it and keep it updated. And there's a limited pot of those to go around as well. It's worth mentioning that one place where those discussions have been happening recently in depth is the virtual workshop being run by GBIF on the advancing the catalogue of the world's natural history collections. And this began a few months ago with an open online consultation, and a white paper should follow over the coming months. But if anyone is interested in that conversation, I very much recommend checking it out on GBIF's discourse forum via their website. Next slide, please. So to address at least some of these challenges that I've just mentioned, the Collection Descriptions Data Standard Task Group was formed within TDWG, which is the Biodiversity Information Standards Organisation. And the task group is formed from volunteers from institutions in multiple countries and also organisations like Addink Bio, Disco, CTAF and GBIF, and is developing a new global data standard for collection descriptions, the first draft of which is due around September this year. And I think it's worth quickly recapping what data standards are and what they're for. And I thought these sentences from the USGS website sum it up rather well. Essentially, they're the rules by which data are described and recorded. And in order to share, exchange, and understand data, we must standardize the format as well as the meaning. And that's what the CD data standard intends to do in order to compare and exchange our collections data, aggregate that data across our collections, and be able to consistently record metrics about our collections, such as numbers of specimens that they hold. A lot of you will already be familiar with Darwin Core, which is another TDWG standard, and this is a bit like Darwin Core, but for collections rather than specimens. Next slide, please. But there are some differences that we've found relating to modelling non-digital collections that really try and break your brain. For one thing, collections are dynamic. They change all the time, whether due to acquisitions or loans or disposals, being split up, being merged together. And that's something of a different challenge to tracking a single object or specimen moving around. They also tend to overlap. So a paleontology collection might contain a Darwin fossils collection, for example, which is also part of a wider Darwin collection across multiple institutions. And so there's a danger of counting things multiple times if that's not treated carefully. And then just to add to the pain a bit, we're always dealing with different levels of uncertainty, as when describing a collection, we often don't know exactly what is in it or how many of them there are. And then finally, the whole concept of a collection is heavily contextual. It depends very much on the purpose for which you're describing it, and we may want to break down the same collection in multiple ways, but for different purposes. Next slide, please. So this slide is really to emphasize that last point. The TDWG group gathered and analyzed a large number of use cases for collection descriptions, building also on the work carried out in previous DISCO projects like ICOM. And as you can see, it's a pretty broad spectrum. On the right-hand side, you can see a range of the different purposes for using collection descriptions, which is from high-level collections discovery to really quite detailed collections inventory and management. And those are relevant to different groups of audiences. And for those purposes and audiences, the collections need to be broken down by one or more of a number of dimensions, which reflect categorizations that are commonly applied to specimens, for example, taxonomy and stratigraphy and so on. And then attached to those collection descriptions, there can be a range of different information in different formats, depending on the purpose of the collection description scheme. So to support all of these, the CD standard and data model needs to be broad, flexible, and fairly permissive, which means that if you're not careful, you can describe your collections using the CD standard, but still be at risk of comparing apples and oranges. And this is an important factor in working out how the CD standard can be used to support collections data in DISCO. Next slide, please. So you've heard in the last presentation from Wouter a bit about DISCO, the distributed system of scientific collections, and some of its services in development. You've also heard about how specimens and collections both need to be represented within the European Collection Objects Index, and how that digital collections data will help users of ELVIS. In addition to these, we're currently constructing a prototype for the collections digitization dashboard, which will involve a more detailed breakdown of DISCO partners' collections, using multiple dimensions of classification, preservation type, geological time period, and geographic origin. The dashboard will also include estimates of the number of objects, digitized and undigitized, in each category, and measures of the completeness of those digital records according to the minimum information for a digital specimen specification, or MIDS, which you've also heard about earlier. So there are a number of different use cases for collection descriptions here, but how can we apply the TDWG CD standard to them? Next slide. So this is where the apples and oranges come into it. The TDWG CD standard can support the use cases of the European Collection Objects Index, of ELVIS, and the Collections Digitization Dashboard, but we need to add some more constraints for them to be truly consistent and interoperable, and to be able to use the same data wherever relevant. Otherwise, we risk ending up with another collections data fruit salad situation, and that wouldn't really be ideal. So the key to this is to agree a set of specifications within the CD standard for the DISCO implementation, which includes the dimensions that will be used to describe and break down the collections, the controlled vocabularies and hierarchies that will be used, and which metrics are optional or mandatory. Also, there needs to be a common approach to linking digital collections to digital specimens and other digital objects which represent people, institutions, and so on. This is also, I think, relevant to DISCO's interoperability with collection data in other organizations and platforms. So if they all use or map to the CD standard, then a basic level of data interoperability is achieved. However, if that can be extended to agreeing some common control vocabularies, for example, then that interoperability can be greatly enhanced. Next slide, please. So that's a kind of two-level strategy for implementing collection descriptions within DISCO. Why, on top of that, would we want to apply this minimum information for a digital collection specification? Well, I think probably one of the main benefits is to provide clarity to institutions on what data DISCO would like them to provide and why. So it can help to explain why the different services need the data and in what form, and what benefits doing that will provide to the users. And it can also help users, software developers, external platforms, and so on to understand what data is and isn't available within the DISCO infrastructure. And here I'd like to describe a potential approach to the design of MIX, with the caveat that this is more to throw in some ideas than the result of any detailed consultation or design at this point. But firstly, if we're taking a similar approach to MIDS with multiple levels, then it might make sense to align them with the requirements of the DISCO services so that people know why they're being asked for the data. At the same time, each level will represent an increasing amount of effort to contribute the data, so we should keep the initial bar quite low and plan for more detail to be added over time. Because collections aren't a single discrete object, it might make more sense to apply mixed levels to each institution's overall collection descriptions data rather than on a record-by-record basis. And then finally, linking to MIDS levels means that we can start to manage digitized and undigitized collections as part of the same data set, and ultimately start to derive them automatically from the digital specimens within the European Collection Objects Index. Next slide, please. And so this is just a more visual sketch of that overall approach. So everything fits within the CD standard, and then within those rules for the implementation for DISCO. You then, in the red box, have the mandatory elements required by the CD standard as the very base level for data. And on top of that, there could be something like 4 levels, maybe, for the MIX specification. So MIX 0 might be the most basic registration of an institutional collection, so maybe just one collection record, an overall estimate of size, and that could possibly be the bare minimum to register it in the European Collection Objects Index, although it wouldn't be very useful data for very much. But then you could have MIX 1 as an overview, so still just one collection record, one estimate of size, but tagged to give an idea of its scope in terms of geography, taxonomy, preservation types, and stratigraphy. And that might be the minimum required for, say, the ELVIS use case. Then Mix 2 could be a basic breakdown using the collections digitization dashboard scheme into paleontology, mineralogy, botany, etc., with an estimated number for each of those breakdowns and mid-levels for the digitized portion of each sub-collection, and that could form the entry level for the dashboard service. And then finally, Mix 3 would be similar to Mix 2, but a much more detailed breakdown across the 4 dashboard dimensions. And that provides a more powerful data set for the dashboard for monitoring and planning digitization activities. So each level represents more effort to produce the data, but all of the services can potentially benefit from having more detailed information to browse, search, and visualize the collections. Next slide, please. And so very briefly, I think the take-home message is that the TDWG CD standard should be able to form the basis for supporting both collections data, collections descriptions data in DISCO and the MID specification. But the key to making that work effectively is a clear set of rules on how to apply the standard within the DISCO context. And then if you expand that approach, then that might just help to support the wider effort to address some of our collection descriptions challenges, opportunities, not just within DISCO, but on a more global scale. And to say thank you everyone for listening. If we could just move to the final slide, it's got some details there for anyone who wants further information on the TDWG task group. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Matt. I'm just going to leave that slide just up for a couple of seconds longer, just to allow people to get the information that they need. And then I'll now stop sharing. So I'm aware that there are a couple of questions in the question and answers.
The first one is from Deb Paul. Matt, how easy will it be for people to provide a description of their collection or collections? Will they have to go to more than one place, or is there coordination with GBIF, Addink Bio, and others too beyond DISCO? IOW, are there, I don't know what that, are there alignment talks going on?
That's a very good question from Dev. I think the alignment talks have definitely started. They've probably progressed quite well in terms of talks between DISCO and CTAF in terms of aligning DISCO's requirements with the CTAF passports and CTAF registries. And there are other talks around these various fora, but there would also be, I think that GBIF consultation is, we feel, kind of the platform to really bring those conversations together of all the representatives of those different platforms and what their needs and requirements are. So I think that's the basis for the conversation. It's happened quite a lot around the TDWG group, but there's only so much capacity to handle both the how will it all work as well as the how can we create a data standard to support it. But I would very much recommend everyone getting involved in those conversations. That's interesting. It's now is the time to do it.
And the next question is, are you proposing a methodology protocol for estimating collection size?
Not specifically, I think, within the TDWG standard work at this point, but it's something that a lot of us who are working with collection descriptions data are having to address. So I think that would be a very good conversation to have in a bit more detail. There are so many different methods of doing it, and if we can get to an idea of what would be good recommendations for sampling methodologies and how to reflect things like confidence in the estimates that you're putting across, if we can have some kind of guidance and standard methodology for doing that, I think that would be very beneficial. Certainly one that's, if you want to bring it up in the TDWG group, that would be a great place to do it as well.
And the last question I have is, if it were in the IPT, would that mean alignment with EML or its replacement? Or could this be more data type in the IPT?
I'm not sure I can answer that in a very authoritative way, but I would probably be inclined towards more a data type in the IPT. I think we'd need to look at mapping to EML and or its replacement. But from, I think, discussions that we've had in brief with people at GBIF, they'd be probably looking at creating an IPT-like tool for collection descriptions in order to support people being able to put their data up in the same way as they are using the current IPT for their Darwin Core archives about their specimen level collections.
And I'm just going to say there was a bit in the chat about the IPT, and there's some questions about what IPT is. I think there are some acronyms being used that people will not necessarily be familiar with. So I think we'll have a think about translating some of these as we can. But Matt, do you want to just have we've got a couple of minutes. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about IPT?
I'm probably not very well versed in the IPT to talk about it. Strangely, we're one of the institutions that doesn't actually use that to get our data up to GBIF. So I'll probably prefer that particular conversation. I don't know if anyone else here on the panel is able to chip in more on that.
What was the question on IPT again, Elspeth?
It's just people were asking the integrated publishing toolkit, and I think there's some people who are not maybe as familiar with what it is. And it was just maybe if someone had a little bit of background, they could spend a minute just describing an IPT.
So I could maybe describe a little bit because I host one, I publish data through one. Hello, this is Talia Kareem. I'm at University of Colorado. So it's basically a way for you to publish your data on the internet. So any data aggregator, GBIF, Addink Bio, anybody else that wants to pull your data set, it basically puts it there on the web. So it's a public facing web server, I believe, from the technical side of things is how it's set up. And so we export our data from Specify as a CSV, and then it's uploaded through the IPT, and then you do all your Darwin Core mapping within the IPT. And then it publishes it, your data set as a Darwin Core archive. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Talia, because I think it's something that we're aware that there's a lot of people joining this session who may not have all the background, and it's a chance to give them a little bit more information as well. And I can see in the chat that I think Sarah's put a link to the GBIF IPT website as well. So if people want more information, they can go to that too. Thank you. So thank you very much, Matt. And I think we'll go now to the next talk. And the next talk will be from Mareike Petersen from the Museum for Natuurkunde. And I'll just get my screen sharing sorted.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Elspeth. So in the next couple of minutes, I would like to step back a bit to the institutional side and present an example on the development of specimen level description at the MFN in Berlin and how these results, this compilation relates to MIDS. Next slide, please. Luckily, the MFN received a huge amount of funding in this year, last year, for the disclosure and digitization of our collection. Of course, to different depths of the disclosure, but nevertheless, we should have everything in place and know what we have in our collection. I was thinking of when we got that opportunity, how can we describe our specimen in a more common way? So because we have all these different collection management systems, we are getting maybe new stuff, working cross collections. And I think, in my opinion, it would be really helpful to establish a list of elements, which is, first of all, of course, important for the description of a specimen, which is independent of any collection management system. So because many people, especially curators, collection managers, they always have some constraints, which is somehow related to the legacy system. And so this should also be independent of the taxonomic group, so also including minerals, zoology, fossils, and so on. And I was also already from the beginning on thinking of to incorporate different levels of necessary information for different purposes. Of course, I don't want to build everything from scratch. Next slide, please, and not invent the wheel new. And so I really got inspired of all the different initiatives and projects which were already mentioned here in this symposium, like the collection description dashboard developed in ICOM and consolidated in Synthesis Plus, the collection description standard, all the use cases, user analysis collected there, but also some national requirements like the basic data set from the German Research Foundation, and also from the data standard ABCD, we did some application schemata in the last project. So if you want to publish your zoological collection data, what kind of information might be needed. So next slide, please. But of course, you always have some institutional concerns of all those big initiatives and projects. So I did an all-hands workshop with all curators and collection managers, once again to collect their requirements, their demands, and later on, I did this somehow sub-collection related. So I met with all the vertebrate people, with all the fossil people, and so on. So what I wanted to develop was a compilation which is compliant with internal, but also with national and international requirements. Next slide, please. Also, right from the beginning, I was, of course, thinking of relevant reference systems. So they're so far not all already incorporated, but there's space to put them in. Next slide. So based on all those different work and meetings and consolidations, I received this funny, colorful image. And it was just now for this talk that I found maybe MyPod is a good abbreviation of this minimum extent of information and purpose-oriented specimen description. Next slide, please. So in the beginning, you have this kind of minimum extent information where you have this basic information of an collection object, like what is it for an object? Is it a fossil specimen? Is it a preserved specimen? Which institution is holding it? Is there any information whether it's a type or not? The scientific name, if available, if not, some descriptive title, and of course, a collection ID. And if this is not globally persistent, then an additional global persistent identifier. Next slide, please. And depending on the purpose, this kind of minimum extent can then be extended to various use cases. For example, if you have a type collection, you add information, what kind of type is it? So is it a holotype, a syntype, etc. And also, of course, the author. If there's already an ID like an ORCID available, you can add this as well, like the year of description. Next slide, please. And all those other elements are more topic related. So I was thinking of information which is coming from the labels, from the old analog collection catalogs, information on the preparation of the specimen, object details like whether sex or size of the object. Next slide, please. But also information where it is coming from, so more or less the history of the collection object, like former holding institutions of former collection IDs, information on the gathering event, on the identification. Here you could also think of like the historical identification, so one identification event per time. Next slide, please. And also some associated material, which is not directly maybe stored in the collection management system, but where you should have links like for the access and benefit sharing, which is all linked then via the global persistent identifier of this collection specimen. And also information on the condition, whether this is really fragmented or if it is already, or if it is available in the collection. Next slide, please. So just to come up with some use cases, I'm currently working with one curator together, and this particular collection does not have a collection management system yet at our house. We have different systems, but this collection does not use any of them. And so we transferred the old collection catalog into a digital form. They were just typing it up from into an Excel spreadsheet, and I helped them to sort it out to get it a bit more structured. And this was a really nice iterative process, testing the form and adding things like also some geoname so that we can get the links of or the persistent numbers from geonames into this Excel sheet as well, and so on. And I think we would have been finished with all the things, but given COVID-19, it took us longer than expected. But the next step would be to apply this form for further collection, and then in a later step, of course, have a kind of target system, collection management system where all the information can be stored. And another use case would be, for example, if you have some imaging during the object digitization events, you need to gather some information directly from the specimen. And so you can build a subset of all this amount of different elements and compile it together and use it. Next slide, please. So we were hearing a lot about myths in this symposium already. And if you now compare it to the minimum extent of information which was developed or somehow compiled at our house, next slide, please. You see that if you compare the first levels to each other, they are really comparable. So there's no big difference. On later levels, of course, you have differences because what I was working on is more purpose related, whereas MIDS is just increasing in the number of information from level to level. However, in the last level where you have maybe more or less all information which is available to a collection item, they might be also similar, of course. Next slide, please. So I think that approach, what I was doing at the MFN was really successful and really useful also to contact again the collection managers and that they are thinking not, because usually they do have their collection management system and some things are working nice, others don't, but thinking a bit independently of this is what would be really helpful. In the beginning, I was not so much involved in MIDS and I was thinking of more or less the same, having this kind of levels for the disclosure. But the collection managers told me that the variation even within one sub collection is so high that they cannot assign one particular level to their collection. And there was also a huge vary of the collection managers that they are somehow measured according to the level their collection has. However, we are now one of the institutions really interested in MIDS, and we need to implement it now already under the umbrella of Synthesis Plus and Collection Description Dashboard. And I think it's really great to determine the progress along the disclosure and digitization. And since this is coming from the outside, it's better compared to develop something like this inside of the house. And I'm strongly involved in the development of MIDS as well, so this is really helpful. And I think it's really good also if you have some funding bodies and then to show them that from year 1 to year 10, how the levels of a different collection changed. Yeah, thanks. Last slide, please. Yeah, with this, I'm already at the end. And of course, I would like to thank all the collection managers and head of collection helping with this huge compilation of elements and the outcomes of the different projects and initiatives. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Mareike. I'm just going to stop sharing so that we can see. And yeah, it's been great. That experience that you've been bringing that experience into the MIDS as well is fantastic. But I think there's at least one question coming in. So
there's one question that I assume is not Barbara Tears. Does this speak to the requirement for an institutional standard part of NCD and a 1 to M relationship to one or more collection standards, current NCD? Someone might have to translate that for me to ask that.
Yes.
I think it's the one to many, I think, is one to many relationship.
Okay. Thank you.
No, I don't think that you need an institutional standard. So this was just that what kind of information are needed. And for most elements, there's a direct translation into a standard or any other reference already available. So I was not picking up anything we were not thinking of in the beginning.
Okay, I think there's one more just come in.
This is from Deb Paul. The institutional standard could be ROR. Is that?
I see this just as a comment.
Okay, yeah, it's a.
So I'm aware that there's quite a lot been going on in the chat on this, although there's not so much coming into the Q&A. So I was just trying to go through.
Elspeth, there's also a question from Dirk, but he wants to be. He wants the mic on for him.
Yep.
And I don't know if he wants to do it now or wait until the end of your session, your talk.
We could do it now if I can find him. Is anyone else able to find him quickly to unmute, or am I the only person? Oh, here we go. Thank you, Dirk.
Oh, got it.
So, yeah, thank you. Besides all the enthusiasm to publish data, so there are different dimensions in that, because we are increasing, of course, our visibility, and not only the visibility to our folks, which is the research community, but also to others. And it has been, I think it was 2018, the Research Data Alliance Conference 2018 in Botswana, where it was noted that biodiversity data sets that were, I'm not sure if it was GBIF where they were available, but you could deduce from the data that the faunal composition changed to climate change. And these data sets came from a country which were not very happy that this data was released and that this information could be deduced from the data sets. And so the institution got some issues on that. And also we do know under Nagoya, we have several countries which use the available data that is out there for active tracing if there would be any violations against regs, access to those materials. We also should consider claims of repatriation, because when some things get more visible, we had the case with released paleontology data sets which were harvested one day after the release twice. And so you can question yourself, was that the regulator in the country that loved to check permits, or was that looters which were just happy to have the exact GPS coordinates for those places to go out and do some digging? And if and also under DISCO, so if Elvis, for example, covers DNAs and tissues, there are some layers. I don't want to dive too deep into details here, but maybe a last point we have seen with data release on GGBN for tissues and DNAs, that included CITES specimens, which is, so you're opening a market there, even though the things are not sold. That is, of course, a violation against CITES. And if I would be happy if the people engaged would not just leave it the institutions and the institutional policy and institutional policy decision, but I think there should be some general considerations about standards and approaches, because I think that is a crucial point we need to consider here. So we increase our visibility, yes, but to all that are out there. And so I would be happy to have some feedback on those thoughts from the panelists.
So they're big questions. And I think actually it's been good to ask them now, because it will also give people time to think further. And we can also bring this up at the end of the session a little bit as well. And it'll give people a little bit more time to have a think about it and to come back with some of their thoughts. I think, I mean, from my view, I think you're looking at the two levels. There is responsibility, and this responsibility runs all the way through collections, from the individual collector in the original collection event, all the way through to the institute where the collections are being held, and also to the aggregating organizations and platforms where they're publishing the data. And I think at each level there is responsibility. And so I think the discussion, I think it's going to be a good discussion. It's one that we will have to have. We have been having, and we have to continue. So I'm just going to ask, we've got just a couple of minutes. Can I just ask the panel, would anyone like to come to respond just now on this?
It's Alex, the first speaker. I could maybe ask another question, if not respond directly, which is that, you know, I think that Dirk raises, you know, some very important, you know, concerns and sensitivities around some of the aspects of the data that we are trying to make more openly available. And I wonder whether there is a tension between that and the ambitions and demands of open science, which you know, largely are being you know, dictated to us by funders and that kind of thing. I wonder whether there are some incompatibilities there that have not been adequately thought through at the policy level. I don't have an answer to the problem, but it's certainly one that we need to take up and think much more carefully about.
Thank you, Alex. So I think what we'll do, Wouter, I know you were going to be coming back too, but I'm just aware of the time. I think I would like to bring us back to this at the end of the session as well. I think it would be useful to have a little bit more discussion at the end. And as I say, it'll give people some time to have a think as well. But the next presentation we'll move on to is by Andrea Uehling, but I'm actually not seeing Andrea in on here. Andrea, are you with us?
We just promoted her.
Oh, thank you.
She was on the attendees side.
Great.
Sorry
Hello, Andrea.
I was looking for stable internet connection and it got
Super.
a little long.
So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen so that you can see your talk. And I'll hand over to you, Andrea.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Hi everyone, my name is Andrea Uehling. I'm an undergraduate at the University of Utah studying anthropology, as well as history and geospatial intelligence, and I am very privileged to work at the University of Utah's Natural History Museum of Utah as a paleontology digitization technician. And so today I wanted to give you an undergraduate's perspective of the digitization and imaging that the University of Utah and the Natural History Museum of Utah does. Next slide. So digitization strategies started at the Natural History Museum of Utah in 2019, and it started with a 5-year goal of 50,000 paleontological specimens imaged and digitized, as well as 5,000 catalog cards digitized as well. And the first outcome of the digitization initiative hopes to achieve is to promote student success to transform lives. And the museum support that they're using through the digitization initiative encourages the next generation of museum professionals while ensuring that the usable level of MIDS data is collected. Next slide. So the minimum information standards of digitization are slightly different for the Natural History Museum of Utah. Fossils are photographed with their specimen card and ruler, and this allows for a baseline information to be taken without any sort of database behind it. We have the picture of the fossil, we have the information that we currently keep with the fossil. And when photographing smaller details, we superimpose the text on the card to the photo, so this way it is readable in any situation. Any information is then transcribed and superimposed, so this way we can share it. They're saved as TIFF files for archival quality, and all component views are merged, as you can see on the bottom left-hand screen, are merged into a derivative JPEG file. The photo is then linked with records in EMU, which is transcribed, where transcribed data is also being aggregated. So by allowing the bare and basic information to shape the needs of the rest of the digitization initiative, there's a better understanding of A, what we need to do with that digitized information, and B, how best to store and catalog that information. One of the really innovative ways that we've come up with to capture even more basic data, just entering this information into our system, is an organized file naming system and an organized file system, and naming structure. So this way, widespread data can be organized quickly and correctly as we put it in. Next slide, please. So all transcription at the Natural History Museum of Utah starts out as bare, meaning that the information is there with no searchable text. When we scan the prep sheets, as you can see on the left-hand side, text recognition can help create the template that we then transcribe to using Digivol. The Digivol transcription starts with transcribing all of the information not labeled and then moving to text entry fields below. So far during quarantine, I have transcribed, I think, I have validated, 185 pages that have been transcribed by volunteers for the University of Utah Natural History Museum. Next slide, please. So how to integrate students into this process. If they're applying to work in a museum, they're very interested in working in a museum, and that interest should be fostered. University students are already in a mindset to learn and learn quickly. So using that interest and that ability to digest information can be really useful to the museum. And these skills that the museum is fostering translates to skills outside of the museum as well. Part of the student's solution is to Google stuff, and they're very quick to do it. They're quick to look up a YouTube tutorial, and they're quick to look up forum information and try and aggregate as much information as possible about a possible solution to implement it, because that's what they do in university. Taking opportunities to teach them about digitizing in the museum allows them to learn the process, which then grows with them as a museum professional. Next slide, please. So the support of the museum is a two-way street, supporting the work students do financially, as well as supporting them through valuing the work they do and providing autonomy. So the applicable skills are continued benefits for the museum as they either continue to grow into the museum or look for outside jobs. But the Natural History Museum of Utah has structures in place so that students can continue to work through home through quarantine. It made the transition very easy, and that autonomy that was given before quarantine transcribed over to what we were doing during quarantine, and this allows for the museum to continue its transcription and digitization efforts, and it still allows us to work in the museum and feel like we're being valued as part of the museum staff. As you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, that's myself and my coworker Jenny holding up lights for oversized fossil photography and imaging, which was a very fun day, and I will talk about that in just a moment. Next slide, please. So figuring digitization out is a very important step because it's the first step in any digitization initiative. Tools will always make the job easier, and one really easy way to support your museum staff is to get the right tools for the job. On the right is my digitization workstation in paleontology collections. It's modular, so I can set that up however I need to image whatever size fossil I need to. It means I can take the camera to the fossil if it's oversized, or I can take the fossil to the camera and then set it up as necessary there. And then on the right side, even further than this photo unfortunately allows, is my computer. So that means I can quickly take those files over to the computer, double check them, make sure that all of the information that I want captured is in fact in the image. And maybe not quickly or maybe not easily, I can fix those mistakes if there are ones. The Natural History Museum of Utah uses a Nikon Z7 mirrorless camera. We bought that camera to anticipate for any future imaging needs, but the source at the bottom of the screen does do a very good job outlining the differences between an iPhone camera and a both mirrorless and DSLR cameras. So even for just collecting bare minimum information for what you have in the collection, an iPhone might be able to work for what you need it to. And higher quality tools don't necessarily make high quality digitization work. iDigBio has a comparison price across different budgets for different tools that can be useful in collections and imaging, but I found that pillowcases over lights make great lights to photograph with, and a car reflection or a car reflector for windshields can reflect light just as good as the one for photography. Next slide, please. So how to utilize students in the museum for digitization and imaging. You throw them at a problem and see what they can come up with. The more solutions that students come up with, the more solutions they have in their back pocket to overcome whatever problems might come up. And solutions are not one size fits all. Solutions can be used for solutions in others. So oversized fossil photography on the left-hand side versus paleobotany photography on the right side, two very different scopes of imaging, but the imaging that we did for these photos wound up having the same problems in Photoshop, trying to light it correctly, trying to find the correct focal length to include within the metadata of the photo. So solutions for one ended up having us learn a little bit more about solutions for the other. Having students learn these solutions create really well-rounded museum workers that are able to overcome other problems slightly more quickly. Next slide, please. So starting out, not everything is going to be perfect the first time through. Giving staff support to make the changes to the process allows for them to grow and learn the best way to do something, and that means that possibly you might need to go back and re-digitize or re-image something, maybe rename file folders in a way that's more conducive to capturing basic information and allowing for shared vocabulary across the museum. Creating a standard operating procedure has been one of the best ways to keep the Natural History Museum staff on the same page in terms of vocabularies and procedures to be done for digitization and imaging. Personally, I found a way to stack photos in a less resource intensive way by Googling it and finding a YouTube tutorial. And from that, I took it to Allison, my manager, who's on the ladder on the right-hand side of the screen, and she put it into the standard operating procedure, and now everyone in the museum can use that procedure as a way to stack photos with varying focal lengths in a less resource intensive way, and also making sure that we don't take the entomology stacking software away from people who need it at that moment. Another great reason to have a standard operating procedure is to reference it as you're working through problems. So staff usually will have references that they can draw up at any time. Undergraduates need that resource as well, and it creates a lot less micromanagement necessary for managers if undergraduates can use those resources at any given time. It also allows for teaching a little bit quicker. You don't have to just try to inform undergraduates exactly of what they're supposed to do from rote memory every single time. You can have a book to teach from, and this way everyone is getting the minimum information when they start out. Next slide, please. So undergraduates factoring into the plan. Across the museum collection in the last year alone, 13,000 catalog pages have been transcribed and validated. For 34,000 pages and physical photographs imaged and databased. There are 9 digitization techs, and there have been 531 volunteers. And that's just in the past year alone as we've started the digitization initiative. So far, we have had 85 volunteers just during, since April, 85 volunteers have transcribed 2,040 paleontology tasks on Digivol. And between my coworker and myself, on the right-hand side of the screen, Jenny and myself, we've digitized nearly in the entirety of the paleontology archive, which I think is pretty good numbers. Figuring we just started last year, it really puts it into perspective that undergraduates, as we put our mind to a task, we can really get it done and increase the value of the collection because we're able to send it out for digitization in a package deal or in a package image. And next slide. I'd like to thank both the Natural History Museum, Allison Wilkins, my manager, and the University of Utah, and of course all of the lovely moderators at SPNHC. And next slide. And these are all the sources that I used if anyone wanted to check those out.
That was super, Andrea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I know there's a few questions coming through, so I'm going to stop sharing. There's a few questions coming through, so Laurie, if you could help out with the questions.
Okay, Andrea, you said that the transcription of old paper forms was done by volunteers. How do you engage with the volunteers? And do you have a crowdsourcing platform in place?
So we engage with volunteers on Digivol. We do have volunteers for the museum itself, but volunteers are much more present on Digivol. It's a transcription site where we can upload the template, and then volunteers will go through and look at the pages that we've scanned and enter the text fields there, and then digitization text will validate everything that they're doing. So it's making sure that all of the volunteers are putting in the right things, and that digitization text can get can double check it for redundancy as well.
Great. What kind of validation do you use on the images?
So we go through page by page and read it and make sure that everything looks as good as possible. So we're doing it solely by ourselves. No computer programs, unfortunately.
Okay. Hi, Andrea. You shared how you just went away. You shared how you disseminate new improvements you figure out to staff. Do you have any ideas for how we can do this across our larger museum to museum networks?
So I have some ideas, but I also know that my manager, Allison Wilkins, probably has a better grasp on how to do that for larger museums. We have our standard operating procedure in a binder as well as in our file system so that anyone can pull it up at any time. I would assume that that would be a useful way for larger museums as well, but I think Allison might have a better grasp on that than I would.
Okay. Would you make any changes to your workflow?
For workflow, during quarantine, I have really appreciated the flexibility and hours that validation has allowed. Unfortunately, being at home during quarantine means that I can't get to the server, so I have to download everything and then re-upload it to the box that we use, the University of Utah box system. That's so far has been the only change in my workflow as I've worked from home. But as I work in the museum, I really think that the way the collections is set up, especially for imaging, and then the validation of imaging on a computer really close by, has been the best setup for me personally. There are also computers on another level that are we use them solely for like editing and transcription and validation. So I think the way that we've set it up has been the most useful, especially in collections. If we're validating imaging tasks, being able to quickly fix that problem has been really helpful.
Okay, the next one. What error rate have you come across during transcription, and how are you validating the data? I guess this is, you answered part of this. This is usually the most time-consuming part of any digitization project. Yes,
that is true. So far, we have, so on Digivol, we have managed to put in tips for each validation task. It has a text entry box, and then right next to it, it has a little question mark, and you can click that. There is a description of what should be in the text box. And before any of the volunteers start on their on their transcriptions, excuse me, there is a short video or short document showing exactly how it should look like. So we try to mitigate any sort of problems with transcription using those steps. But I found that a lot of the errors are just formatting issues. All of the information is there. I just have to move the date around because I know that the date is going to get entered wrong into EMU if it's not in a certain way. And unfortunately, there are some transcription tasks that are just weird, and it takes a lot more brain power to try and figure out what's going on the page. And those are very few and far between, but they take up more time than the correctly done ones.
Okay, I know there's more questions in the Q&A, but I'm also aware of the time. So what's interesting is the number of questions and the interest people do have still in the practical workflows and processes of digitization. And I think it was nice also to see that when we're looking at some of the standards for MIDS and MIX, the importance of looking at the practical implementation and application of these is always really important. Thank you very much, Andrea.
Thank you.
So the final talk in the session is going to be by myself, and I'm sorry. Now my throat goes. I hope I can manage to do this myself. So I'm just seeing my screen share. Fine. Okay, so as I say, this is the final talk of the session, and really this story started for me with two separate strands, essentially leading to the same question. Sorry. So CTAF is the Consortium of European Taxonomic Facilities. It's got 37 members representing 63 institutes, and these hold over half the world's biological collections. So the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh is one of the members of CTAF, and it has a herbarium of about 3 million specimens and a living collection of just over 13,000 plants. So whilst RBGE was developing an active digitization program and which built essentially on previous projects to record the collections, CTAF was developing a strategy and a strategic development plan which included a target to digitize 10% of their 1.5 billion specimens. So this began the quest to calculate how many specimens had already been digitized. So for CTAF, this would mean finding the information relating to each individual institute and bringing them together. And there are different approaches for doing that. For RBGE, this would mean digging into our data to determine what the digitization status was for each specimen. And so now the big question came up, and what do we mean by digitized? So realizing that we had to find the answer to a fairly fundamental question, we joined forces with work that was being carried out in the EU-funded ICOM project to work on developing a digitization standard that we could use to clearly define what was meant by 10% of specimens digitized. So developing the standard, the minimal information about a digital specimen, was really helped by looking at use cases to explore the needs of the community. And this included looking at the history of digitization programs to get an understanding of how the status of digitization of a collection is what it is today. It also looked at the needs of the users of the digital specimens to ensure that the standards served a useful purpose when they were developed. So here, I'm just going to look at an example of a digitization program. It's one at RBGE, just to show some of the challenges involved in defining the digitization status within a collection. And I'm also going to look at the wider challenges of defining the digitization status across multiple collections. So as I mentioned, RBGE has a herbarium of about 3 million specimens. So we carried out a very quick review of our records, and for this we used a transcription completeness field in our database against the estimated total collection size. And here you can see the figures both without and with an image. And you can see that we've got in the region of nearly 1 million specimens have been digitized without an image, and we have about 250,000 specimens with an image. So as we essentially drilling down into these figures, it's really useful to get a better understanding of some of the variation within the collection. So as we began to database our specimens, there were many different levels of data capture taking place. So in line with many other institutes, a key driver for databasing our collections has been the loans. And all our loans were partially transcribed before being shipped. More recently, we've been transitioning to minimal data capture with imaging. And these minimal records are also currently recorded as partially transcribed. even though the level of data is very much less. And as a number of our specimens have been completely transcribed, and this was driven by a range of reasons, including the members of staff working on the Chilean flora, who have for many years carried out complete label transcription of pretty much every specimen from Chile. We had received government funding, which enabled us to start a large-scale digitization project with specimens from Southwest Asia and the Middle East. And this area is prioritized based on our historical and current research programs in this area. And RBGE has a long history of working with the Chinese flora, and many of the genera of the focus research groups, including, for example, rhododendron, have a strong presence in the Chinese region. So when we break down the figures for this basic, our basic measure of digitization by geographical filing region in the herbarium, we can see the impact of these projects on the data capture. And when we then look at the breakdown across major taxonomic groups, we can also see the impact of data capture effort in particular groups, particularly, as you can see here, in the gymnosperm collection. And this was driven by the work of the International Conifer Conservation Project based at RBGE. So up till now, I've been showing the figures for digitization based on a very imprecise measure. And within the partial category, as I mentioned, there's huge variation of the level of data being transcribed. So now we're looking at developing a more precise and explicit measure of digitization. So we've already had an overview of the MIDS structure, and I'd like to look more closely at the user requirements with digitized specimens, as well as how we carry out the MIDS assessments. So MIDS level 1, as we saw, it generally provides a virtual representation of the specimens in the cabinets, and therefore it should allow a good overview of the collection. The scientific name of the specimen is one of the most frequent methods of arranging the specimens within collections, and it's therefore really critical to being able to find the physical specimens. So this is also one of the most important pieces of information for the use of specimens for taxonomic research. And the name applied to the specimen will allow the researchers to find relevant specimens. And where the name is only down to genus or above, it would enable prioritization of specimens for additional identification work, for example. So given the importance of the scientific name, it's not surprising that this is the element of data that's most generally captured at the first stages of digitization, and it's therefore most often present in digitized specimens. So here you can see we've got about just under 1 million specimens at MIDS level 1, and about 500,000 at MIDS level 1 with an image. And this was a pretty straightforward figure to reach. So then we look at MIDS level 2, and as we saw earlier, this is really for the level for biodiversity research, and the key information needed from specimens are really the what, the who, the when, and the where. So we covered the what in MIDS level 1 with a scientific name. The who and when have been used for hundreds of years to define and cite specimens before the era of the barcode. As for the where, the georeference data are really vital now for distribution modeling, conservation assessments, understanding environmental impact of trait data, so it's a really key piece of the picture for the specimen. So calculating the MIDS level 2 was significantly more complex. So there's a huge impact of not recording whether the data are absent because they've not been transcribed, or they're sensitive, or they're not on the label in the first place. So based on a query which focused on the lat long and the date, we have only 99,000 specimens at MIDS level 2. As we heard, there's no real notion of a completely recorded specimen, but for MIDS level 3, this was really the only measure we could use at present to due to the issue of the missing data and null values. Sorry, it says MIDS level 1 at the top, but this is MIDS level 3. So based on our simplified measure of specimens that we have recorded as being completely transcribed, we have about 250,000 specimens at MIDS level 3 and about 160,000 with an image. So given that this figure is so much higher than the MIDS level 2 that we saw just before, it shows the problem that we have with missing data. So this essentially gives you an idea of how one institute can start to measure their digitization more precisely. Within the CTF community, the Digitization Working Group has been tasked with measuring the state of digitization across the 63 CTF institutes in order to discover where we are in relation to the target of 10%. So there are different approaches, as we mentioned, to doing this. There's a top-down approach where we're looking at some of the aggregators and filtering the data in the aggregators, such as GBIF and GeoCase. There are issues, as I mentioned, of missing data. And there's also major issues in actually, as we've seen earlier with the mix, we have, it's not a trivial task due to the lack of standardization in the identifiers, institute identifiers. And the other option being to run local scripts within each institute. Again, that's going to be dependent on each institute's capacity. So in summary, the aim of MIDS is really to enable more strategic digitization of collections, where each piece of data fits into an underlying purpose and use. And this will help collection managers direct digitization effort into the elements of data that are most used to the end users, including curators and collection managers themselves, but also researchers and bioinformaticians. So part of this picture is about specimen digitization pipelines and ensuring that each specimen is sent along the relevant pipeline using the human and automated processes where possible. An example of these is pipelines will be the georeferencing one. So if we can filter the specimens which do not have a lat long on the label, then we can put them into a georeferencing pipeline. As I've emphasized already, the recording missing data in our collection management systems is going to be really important for our data pipelines in the future. And I'd recommend a paper that came out of the ICOM project here on data transcription standards that helps deal with the missing data issue. And just to say a huge thank you to the CTAF Digitization Working Group and the Information Science and Technology Commission, ISTC, in CTAF, who've been a lot of discussion about this topic. I'm just going to stop sharing and we'll see if there are
some questions, Elspeth.
Thank you.
The first, oh, I don't know what happened to me. The first one, I'm not sure whether it went to Andrea or to you, but does complete transcription also include the complete annotation history of the specimen?
Yes, so if that's for me, then I can answer that one. In our program, the complete transcription, yes, would include the annotation, as in particularly the determinations on the specimen. They would be included within complete. transcription, yes.
Okay, the second, when you use the term minimal data capture, are you speaking directly about MIDS level 1, or is there another definition for your use of the term?
No, I'm using a different definition. Our minimal data capture is essentially the one that we used in-house, and it captures the barcode, the geographical filing region, and the scientific name.
Should we refrain from using the phrase complete digitization altogether? Is there a risk that funders understand this to mean an end state?
Yes, I'm very much in favour of this. We have been using it, and I think we should move away from it. I don't think there is such a thing as a complete digitization. There's always going to be potentially more annotations, more information coming through about specimens. So I don't think we're going to reach a complete digitization situation. And I think it is helpful to move away from it.
Will data visualization be available in our collection management systems, or available in our collection management systems, allow us to visualize the MIDS level of completeness as you shared via a pie chart in your slide?
Yes, I'm trying to understand the question. Data visualization. I think essentially there's two ways we can enter a MIDS level into our CMS system, and that would be a quick way of doing it, or we can interpret the data, query it to determine the information. I'm not sure if that's really answered the question though.
The last question is a general collection or general question, Elspeth.
Mm-hmm.
When digitalization first started, it basically was photographs of specimens. In today's society of shared knowledge, how much CT scans, 3D images, and other high-tech images do museums have, and should the requirements of digitization now include these as a part of the standards and requirements?
Yeah, I think this is going to be the next thing to come. Certainly for imaging, I think one thing we discovered when we were looking at MIDS was the complexity and the need for imaging standards. And I think that's going to be the next thing that we're going to be having to tackle as a community. And there's going to be some really interesting discussions coming about that in the future, I have no doubt. And I can see there's a title of the paper. I will aim to put that hopefully in the chat. And I'm also aware, I apologise because that's taken our time, and I had hoped to come back to Dirk's question from earlier. But I think if I can, I think Dirk's question would be an interesting one to take forwards. I think it's not been, it's not something we can not look at in the future. So I'm looking at either Talia or I know Deb maybe. We can maybe think about including that in future iterations or in future discussions. Dirk, I can see your hand up.
Maybe just a quick comment to that, because Alex also raised the point. There is the open access strategy of the EU, which refers to research data. And it's interesting to see that this mainly refers to research data that is coming from the public sector and not from the private one. We see that in parallel in the DSI discussions of the Nagoya Protocol, and we should ask ourselves, so if we provide the data, for example, to nucleotides, who could use it? And under Article 10 Nagoya Protocol, we were back in the loophole discussion exactly for that reason. And the risk there is that there are strong voices that want to maintain this discussion, and they're very happy to use iconic names. And as we have seen last year with Oxford, which openly distanced the institution from two amateurs, that could lead to scientific death. And we should...
Sorry, Derek, I have to apologize, but I'm also aware of the time, so we will have to leave it there. But I think, as I've said, this is going to be one that we will continue discussion on this. But other than that, I just want to thank everyone for joining the session. It was a real pleasure and some really interesting talks. So thank you to all the speakers at the session, and to Laurie and Deb and Talia, thank you very much for your help as well.
This was a great session, Elspeth. And just a couple housekeeping things. We are recording the session and we will be reposting it on YouTube. I know I'm going to watch it again because I have a lot of questions. And yeah, so thank you to all our speakers and to all our helpers and moderators, and thanks everyone for participating in the chat. It's a great session.